or how to improve maths use to talk about buying and selling. Samuelson was born in Gary, Indiana on May 15, 1915. He died on December 13, 2009 in Belmont, Massachusetts, USA. He was born to Frank Samuelson, a pharmacist, and Eleni Lipton. His family, he later said, was, quote, made up of upwardly mobile Jewish immigrants from Poland who had prospered considerably in World War I, because Gary was a brand new steel town when my family went there, end of quote. In 1923, Samuelson moved to Chicago, where he graduated from Hyde Park High School. He then studied at the University of Chicago at age 16 and received his Bachelor of Arts degree there in 1935. A young man into a long journey, I guess. In 1923, he moved to Chicago, where he began studying economics at the university at age 16. Quote, I was born as an economist on January 2, 1932, end of quote, he said. That was the day he heard his first college lecture on Thomas Malthus, the 18th century British economist who studied the relation between poverty and population growth. Hooked, he began taking economics courses. From Chicago, he went on in 1935 to graduate school in economics at Harvard, where he encountered the now legendary figures of Joseph Schumpeter and Vasily Leontiev. His talent was soon recognized, and he presented his doctoral thesis at Harvard in 1941. Growing up during the Depression influenced his economic and political views. His 1948 work, Economics, reaching to help provide for his 6 children, has become the world's best-selling economic textbook. He served as an advisor to both John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. Throughout his very successful career, Samuelson explained economics to many, but most notably to John F. Kennedy. Quote, my most important hour was when I was his economic advisor, he said. I am happy to look back on the fact that before he was assassinated, we did get the country moving again economically. We did bring a recession to an end, end of quote. I want to share 3 statements Samuelson produced, which seem to me very important to understand his work. Quote, I don't care who writes a nation's laws or crafts its advanced treatises if I can write its economics textbooks, end of quote. Quote, sooner or later, the internet will become profitable. It's an old story played before by tunnels, railroads, and automobiles, end of quote. Quote, economics, it's not an exact science. It's a combination of an art and elements of science. And that's almost the first and last lesson to be learned about economics, that in my judgment, we are not converging toward exactitude, but we're improving our databases and our ways of reasoning about them, end of quote. In this age of specialization, I sometimes think of myself as the last generalist in economics, wrote Samuelson, with interests that range from mathematical economics down to current financial journalism. My real interests are research and teaching. His work in economic theory has been in modern welfare economics, linear programming, Keynesian economics, economic dynamics, international trade theory, logic, choice, and maximization. In terms of economic philosophy, Professor Samuelson called himself a modern economist in the right wing of the democratic New Deal economists. Samuelson got a good reputation derived from his rarefied mathematical skills, but he became one of the discipline's great communicators too. In the years just before and during the Second World War, Samuelson, mentored by Alvin Hansen, a professor of economics at Harvard University, began to think about how government spending could be used to make sure that there was never another Great Depression. Samuelson in Harvard was a student of Schumpeter and Leontiev. However, of greatest importance to Samuelson was the American polymath Edwin Bidwell Wilson. Under the tutelage of these 3, Samuelson wrote articles on the theory of the consumer, the theory of the firm, and the theory of international trade. Typically, his articles took a long-recognized economic problem, used algebra to capture the essence of it, and then solve it in a way that made it unnecessary for economists who came after to grapple with the literature that had come before him. In 1940, when Samuelson came to write his doctoral dissertation, he sensed that although he was studying apparently diverse fields, he kept encountering and solving the same problems over and over. They were all about choosing the best possible outcome given the constraints facing people. Mathematicians now call it constraint optimization. For example, a business will aim to make as much profit as possible, but has to accept the prices it faces in the market and the technological limitations that determine the inputs required to produce different levels of output. Samuelson tried to put the problem in mathematical terms that could then be applied to different situations in economics. Economic theory was about generating operationally meaningful theorems, by which he meant theorems that could be confronted with data. For example, it was not enough to discuss, as many economists had done, whether consumers maximized something called utility, a measure of how well off someone is. For such a statement to be meaningful, we must be able to derive and test its consequences. If, for example, economists could show that utility maximization implied that when the price of a commodity rose, the quantity a consumer would buy fell, then the theory was operationally meaningful. Prices and quantities both can be observed, and we can see whether the theory is right. The method for deriving such operationally meaningful theorems became known among economists as comparative statistics. Comparative statistics tell us how, when some variable changes, the whole equilibrium changes. For example, in a model of supply and demand, we can show that if the cost of producing a widget rises by $1, then the price determined by the equilibrium of supply and demand will rise by an amount no more than $1. It could be less than $1. To economists, it sounds an obvious point, but it was one that, before Samuelson, no one had made it so forcefully. When Samuelson published his doctoral dissertation as Foundations of Economic Analysis, it was virtually a how-to manual of economic theory. The book represents a conception of theory as mathematical modeling that stood apart from most economic theorizing before the Second World War. It required stating assumptions precisely and then using algebra to derive implications from those assumptions. Samuelson was not the only economist working this way. The Econometric Society, formed in 1930, helped to create a substantial community of economists who apply mathematics to economics. But Samuelson's work did much to promote the general mathematical method. See my video about the first Nobel. In the 1950s and 60s, many economists still pursued theory in the old style, which was less precise, yet apparently more realistic and relied on verbal reasoning. But the more mathematics-oriented approach to economic theory that Samuelson represented was rapidly gaining ground. By the 1970s, any graduate student in economics had to get a certain training in mathematics, an expectation very different from that prevailing even a decade earlier. Economic theory had changed, and Samuelson was one of the key figures responsible for that change. The Nobel Committee implicitly recognized his role in making economics more quantitative and scientific when they awarded him the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1970. As he explored further into the subject of business cycle, he became increasingly concerned with data analysis and conceptual issues related to what Lawrence Klein called the Keynesian revolution. Inspired by the renowned British economist, this involved analyzing the behavior of the economy in terms of aggregates such as gross domestic product and using interest rates, government spending, and taxation to smooth out the business cycle. His most important contribution was his introduction to the neoclassical synthesis. This is the view that under full employment and microeconomic equilibrium, an economy based on neoclassical microeconomics of supply and demand could, for the most part, function efficiently. However, that neo-Keynesian theory better described the macroeconomy and supported the necessary government and macroeconomic policies to achieve and maintain conditions of full employment, which macroeconomic markets required to function efficiently. This general concept of economics is still the dominant paradigm in economics and economic policy. So Paul Samuelson is considered by many to be the founder of neoclassical economics. After the war, the victorious allies moved to establish the institutions that will come to dominate international economic relations, such as the International Monetary Fund. Samuelson wrote articles arguing for a more active U.S. role in the world economy. Samuelson's department chair gave Samuelson the task of writing something that the students will enjoy reading. Samuelson's Economics, 1948, became one of the most influential economic textbooks ever written. The legendary textbook adopted a conversational style and it conveys economic ideas in colloquial ways. Samuelson's textbook was intellectually, visually, and linguistically very far from the dry, theoretical tomes written by earlier generations of authors. In the 1950s, Samuelson began writing regular appraisals of the US economy for the Financial Times in the UK, and by the end of the decade, he was also writing for newspapers in Australia and Japan. Through his association with Hansen, Samuelson had developed a political commitment as a liberal and supporter of the Democratic Party. In 1966, the magazine Newsweek made the decision to modernize its economic columns, hiring 3 economists, Samuelson, Milton Friedman, and Henry Waller, representing left, right, and center, respectively, to write regular columns. For 15 years, until 1981, Samuelson wrote a column every third week, covering the state of the economy, personal investing, and many other topics. Welfare economics, he helped to establish the criteria for deciding whether an action will improve welfare. This criteria came to be known as the Lindau-Bowen-Samuelson condition, a condition for the efficient provision of public goods. When satisfied, this condition implies that further substituting public for private goods or vice versa will result in a decrease of social utility. Finally, Samuelson has influenced international economics through 2 important theories of international trade: the Balassa-Samuelson effect. Consumer price levels are systematically higher in wealthier countries than in poor countries, and the Heckscher-Ohlin model, a general equilibrium mathematical model of the macroeconomy in international trade, in which the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, a basic theorem in trade theory which describes a relation between the relative prices of output goods and relative factor rewards, is utilized. I guess some of you know the stock market. Maybe some of you are beginner investor. Samuelson developed the theory of efficient markets, arguing that if information is freely available, those involved in buying and selling stocks will take it into account. Prices will reflect all publicly available information, which means that unless you have information that other people don't, the only way to make money on the stock market is to be lucky, and you can rely on being lucky, or to be smarter than other people, noticing things that they don't notice, perhaps because you have a better understanding of what is going on. For example, if you have a formula that tells you what a stock option is really worth, while the rest of the market is relying on an inaccurate rule of thumb, you may be able to make a fortune. I guess you get the importance of his contribution. In times of economic crisis, people wonder whether economics and economists are to blame. This happened in the 1970s, and it happened again in 2008 after the global financial crisis. Because people don't understand it, mathematical economics of the type Samuelson did so much to develop naturally comes in for criticism as abstract and irrelevant to the world in which we live. What 2 sides of his work show is that, like many of the best economists of his generation, he was well aware of the limitations of mathematical theories, that models are simplified and sometimes fail to take into account factors that turn out to be important. He learned what he could from mathematical models and was critical of people who dismissed what they couldn't understand. However, thanks to his friendship with Hansen and his wartime experiences, he also learned how to tackle economic problems that couldn't be solved with advanced mathematics. Samuelson's less rigorous methods involved keeping much closer to what's going on and producing arguments that ordinary people could understand. Basically, he put some economics agents' behaviors in formulas to better understand those behaviors and take some kind of control over them. But today, he is remembered above all for introducing Keynes ideas to undergraduates and thence to the wider public, thus popularizing the Keynesian revolution that was already taking hold among the younger economists of the time. Keynesian ideas implied a greater role for government in the economy than is believed proper by laissez-faire ideologists. However, the book also devotes considerable space and effort to explain how markets function and how they solve the central economic organization, what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. In simple words, he brought back the intervention of state in economic social relations. Simple. And yes, that meaning more taxes. So now you can have a better perspective of its importance.